Now it's my very special pleasure to actually present to you a person who's actually written the paper himself and is presenting it. From the RAND Corporation, Senior Associate, prolific writer. I have difficulty catching up with his writings, but not any difficulty understanding it. Okay.
Well, let me first thank Mr. Sisodia, and I think I saw Dr. Kalyan just walk in, for this special opportunity to be on my first ever visit to India to take part in this conference. Also nice to see some familiar American faces out there. John Warden, I haven't seen in a while. My former RAND colleague, Dean Wilkening, from whom you'll hear tomorrow. And Chris Fair, my current colleague, who gave her usual animated presentation during the earlier session. It's also great to see Air Commodore Singh again. Jasjit and I have been fellow sojourners on the International Air Power Conference circuit since we first met more than 20 years ago, I think, at a conference in Australia back in 1986, and we've stayed in touch ever since. I was asked by the conference organizers to speak to the subject displayed on this title slide, and I've done just that in the paper that I submitted for the conference, which simply offers a perspective on how to think about American air power, and most particularly that of the United States Air Force as it has evolved over the past 3 decades. I have not made any attempt in my paper to consider the more specific question of how American air power might relate to some of the regional issues that have been discussed today and that will also be discussed tomorrow. I trust that most of those implications will be either implicit, if not self-evident, and we'll leave it to others to make the connections. Just to give you a quick look ahead at what I'll try and cover in my short time this afternoon, I will say first a few tutorial words on how American air power underwent what I regard as a true renaissance since the Vietnam War almost 3 decades ago, and then summarize the highlights of American air power's subsequent improvements in the ensuing years since Desert Storm, including our most recent involvements very briefly in Iraq and Afghanistan, that account for the major changes that have taken place during that period. I will put a caution notice up front. My focus will be very different from the kinds of issues that were discussed in the previous session. I'll be focusing very much on kind of bombs and bullets and concepts of operations. I face the particular challenge of being the last speaker in the afternoon, and I will try and keep my remarks as short as possible, while at the same time doing my best to do justice to the points that matter most. I think the first point I should stress is that American air power has undergone a truly nonlinear growth in leverage over the past 3 decades, thanks to a final convergence of really 3 more or less concurrent developments. The first is low observability to enemy sensors, more commonly known as stealth. The second being the freedom to attack both fixed and moving targets, generally from safe standoff ranges, with consistent accuracy, both fixed and moving targets, both day and night, and regardless of weather. And finally, the expanded battle space awareness that has been made possible by improvements in, continuing improvements in command and control, and in air and space intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR capabilities, as they are typically called. When I lecture on this subject, I call it my kind of Air Power 101 lecture, to American military audiences at the war colleges, the command and staff colleges, I try to stress up front 3 kind of rules, 3 bounding rules about how to understand what it is when we talk about air power. And first of all, it's not just things. Air power is not just airplanes. It's not just hardware. It's not just equipment. It is the accumulated hardware assets of an air arm coupled with a complex blend of intangibles that you can't quantify, but are often, and in fact usually critically important in determining the extent to which the hardware produces desired combat outcomes. And I have in mind things like doctrine, concepts of operations, training, tactics, proficiency, leadership quality, boldness in execution, and actual combat experience. You know, all of these factors vary enormously among air forces around the world that operate superficially similar and sometimes even identical kinds of equipment, and yet it makes a radical difference in combat outcomes. At the same time, these softer considerations are all too often excluded from considerations of so-called air capability analysis, but in fact I would argue that they are pivotal, sometimes even more important than the equipment itself. Second point is that air power is inseparable from intelligence. They really are two sides of the same coin. Because of the effectiveness of air power, particularly precision, all-weather, day or night attack, it has become fashionable these days to say that air power can kill anything it can see. It is also fashionable to speak, you know, not of the required number of sorties flown per target, but how many targets can be successfully engaged on a single mission. The point that people often forget is air power is more than just attacking and destroying targets. It's also knowing what to hit and where to find it. So again, I stress that air power and intelligence are opposite sides of the same coin. If intelligence fails, air power is as often as not likely to fail as well. And it's not fair. It's a cop-out for airmen to say, well, that was a failure of intelligence, not of air power. They really are inseparable. And third, in the case of the United States at least, air power knows no color of uniform. You know, all too often, air power is equated with the United States Air Force air power, but in fact, at least in our case, it includes the strike assets of the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Army's attack helicopters and surveillance assets. The acceptance of the fact that all four of the services have important roles to play in air employment is the first step toward understanding, really, the meaning and capability of modern air power. I would hasten to add, however, having said that because the United States Air Force is by national law the service that is chartered and resourced to maintain the full spectrum of air capabilities, from strike to mobility to lift to space and all the rest. I will spend most of my time, as directed by my conference organizers here, speaking to that particular subject. I think the most visible and dominant part of the Air Force's transformation took place during the years between Vietnam and Operation Desert Storm that Colonel Warden spoke to you about earlier this morning. It started with the beginning of dissimilar air combat training with the introduction of the aggressor squadrons at Nellis Air Force Base. They first flew the F-5, they first flew the T-38 supersonic trainer, later converted to the F-5E lightweight fighter, intended to replicate the MiG-21, which was the best the Soviet Air Force had at the time. It later included an exercise, a large force exercise that was held about every 6 weeks at Nellis Air Force Base called Red Flag, which has continued really on an annual basis up to now. As most of you know, most recently featured a very successful participation of 8 Indian Air Force Su-30s, very well received by the operators who took part, offered great training value, and as I understand it, are welcome back anytime. The idea behind Red Flag was the notion that analysts had determined that generally if you make it through your first 10 combat missions in wartime, you'll survive the rest of the war, just by virtue of the experience that you build and the knee and the learning curve you approach. And the idea behind Red Flag was to give pilots those first 10 missions in a peacetime environment, controlled, safe, but very realistic training setting. Other innovations included new stress on defense suppression, electronic warfare. At the same time, advent of new equipment. We saw at about the same time that the aggressor program at Red Flag got started, the introduction of the F-15 and the F-16 fourth generation fighters, which at the time greatly exceeded the best that the Soviet Air Force had to offer. The A-10 at the same time was introduced to provide a new dedicated close air support capability with its 30mm cannon, firing a 30-millimeter depleted uranium round that could literally shred tanks at a fairly safe standoff range. The F-4G replaced the F-105 as a dedicated defense suppression aircraft. A night and all-weather version of the F-15 called the F-15E Strike Eagle came in to the inventory, and to this day, or at least until the very recent introduction of the F-22, is the best strike aircraft, I believe, in the world. Final aircraft that made its appearance during that period was one that wasn't even known at the time until it was finally disclosed in 1988, the F-117, the first stealth attack aircraft. It went operational a number of years before Desert Storm, but really only showed its capability for the first time, not just to technicians, but also to airmen during the Gulf War. I have another litany of checklist items here that I'm going to go over. I'm going to skip briefly because I want to save some time. I'll just say in air-to-air, we had two new missiles, the AIM-7F and the AIM-9L, that really revolutionized air-to-air combat, opened up a beyond visual range window for the first time. In the ground attack arena, the emphasis was on new precision munitions, at the time focused mainly on laser-guided bombs. We also introduced the E-3 AWACS and the E-8 Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, wide area surveillance aircraft to really expand the view and the situation awareness of air commanders. I discuss all these developments in great detail in a book of mine that was published in 2000 called The Transformation of American Air Power. I think the bottom line is that convergence of capability, both in the hardware arena and with regard to the softer issues that I discussed, gave the Air Force, really gave American air power across the board the enabling potential it finally gained to leave its mark in Operation Desert Storm during 1991. In the early aftermath of Desert Storm, there were naturally the doubters that, air power really can't do this. Somehow, the Desert Storm experience was a one-of-a-kind anomaly. It was the open desert environment, or it was the unusual vulnerability of Iraq's armored formations, or any number of unique circumstances that somehow made the Gulf War an exception to the rule, that it ultimately takes boots on the ground in large numbers and usually in direct head-to-head combat with enemy forces to prevail in high-intensity warfare. And yet, if you roll forward 12 years later and look at a subsequent succession of really air-enabled, if not air-dominated successes, you see a very different picture. I mean, starting with Operation Deliberate Force and Operation Allied Force in the Balkans in 1995 and 1999, and then moving forward into the major combat phases of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan in 2001, 2002, and then the 3-week period of major combat in 2003 in Operation Iraqi Freedom that brought down the regime of Saddam Hussein. Again, you saw air power play a preeminent role in enabling everything else that happened on the ground. By no means did air power prevail in those engagements all by itself. I mean, these were joint and combined operations to the core. And yet, at the same time, I think it's fair to say that air power was the main enabler of everything else that happened in producing the desired outcome at such a relatively low cost in both friendly and non-combatant enemy lives lost. And to my mind, what that all added up to was not just a succession of anomalies, but really a new way of warfare, at least at the high-intensity level, made possible by the developments that had taken place in the previous couple of decades. I mean, for one thing, every combat aircraft now was precision strike capable. We also had the advent of the second-generation stealth platform and the B-2, which was able to carry 16 satellite-aided joint direct attack munitions and left a major imprint on force employment during the first couple of weeks of Operation Allied Force. In all those campaigns that I mentioned after Desert Storm, there were some common and unifying features. Persistence to pressure on the adversary, rapidity of execution, greater communications connectivity and available bandwidth for commanders, enabled constant surveillance. It also enabled a compression of what's called the kill chain, the sensor to shooter cycle. and really, again, in my kind of humble judgment, reflected, again, I stress, at the high-intensity warfare level, an ongoing paradigm shift in the way the Americans conduct joint warfare that was arguably as profound as the advent of the tank at the beginning of the 21st century. If you look at the capabilities that are fielded today, I think it's fair to say that American air capabilities have evolved to a point where they have finally become truly outcome determining in their potential effects if used properly, and again with a qualification in high intensity warfare. Before the advent of stealth and the precision attack capability that we now take for granted, air offensives just took too many aircraft, too long to produce too few results. One interesting factoid here, someone told me recently that I think it was not until 1943 that the combined British Bomber Command and U.S. Army Air Force's 8th Air Force dropped more tons of bombs than tons of aircraft on German soil during the first half of World War II. In contrast to that experience, today there's no need to amass forces in order to achieve the effects of mass. Precision and much increased survivability allows the effects of mass without actually having the mass. For those of you in colors of uniform other than blue, I would hasten to add that all force elements now have the capability in principle to leverage these technology improvements into combat outcomes. I think the big difference between air power, and in this case not just air power in the United States, but across the spectrum of developed air forces around the world, and certainly quintessentially including the Indian Air Force, air power has pulled ahead of its surface force elements in its relative ability to influence the course and outcome of joint events on the ground. What it has done is increasingly provide a capability to neutralize, degrade, and draw down enemy forces from a fairly safe standoff range with relative impunity, and thereby reduce the threat formerly the ground forces faced and having to confront their ground counterparts in close combat early on. Let me put up here as a bold-faced caution notice that counterinsurgency is a different situation. It makes for a different set of challenges that the American Air Services are still only beginning to grapple with, and I'll come back to this point toward the end of my remarks this afternoon. But if you accept as agreeable in principle what I've told you so far, I think it's safe to say that American air power has been transformed, truly transformed, in its combat capability since Operation Desert Storm, if you accept, as I do, the standard dictionary definition of transform as to change the nature or character of something radically. Transform has gotten to be a bad word in the American defense debate in recent years. It became a bumper sticker slogan during the last administration, and it was taken eventually to mean most anything people wanted it to mean. But if it's used with discipline, the term is powerful. And I really would put it to you that American air power, and increasingly that of its high-end allies, has become transformed in capability. Particularly when you factor in the Navy's carrier air wings, it has imparted something really new under the sun to combatant commanders. I've indicated a list on this slide. I would spotlight intercontinental range bombers with precision conventional capability, a substantial tanker force, global reach, and finally surgical carrier strike groups that can operate as a massed force for the first time. We saw that both in the major combat phases of Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, and where we had as many as 5 carrier air wings working concurrently and over a space of weeks. What these developments have provided, again, I have a list of performance capabilities listed on the slide here. I would stress the ones that matter most are freedom from attack and freedom to attack. Number 2, independence from shore basing for many strike requirements. Number 3, thanks to stealth, unobserved target attack, unobserved approach, and consistently accurate target attack. None of this means that air power can win wars all by itself. That is a bad argument. It is an argument that no responsible airman I have ever heard make. What it does do, though, is allow other force elements, and particularly ground commanders, it gives them the capability for the first time in the history of warfare to produce battlefield situations that will allow friendly ground forces to commit in lower numbers than before, with fewer casualties than before, and producing desired outcomes much more quickly than before. I have some words on space. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this chart and ask you to have a look at the paper that I've written. I will just say that space, although it's taken for granted, really is the enabler, the key enabler increasingly of everything I've said so far, in the aerodynamic arena. Should also say a few words on cyberspace. The United States Air Force has taken the lead recently to move into this third new medium called cyberspace that wasn't, at least in my case, even part of the working vocabulary until recently. I mean, it's really nothing more than a label for the electromagnetic spectrum that we've been operating in since the age of the telegraph. Because it is the domain in which so many of the Air Force's communications and ISR and other enabling capabilities take place, it is one in which the Air Force has increasingly turned its core competencies to try to master. One of the notable features of cyberspace is that unlike the atmosphere and near-Earth space, it is one in which the United States faces peer adversaries today that have the potential and principle of creating really the electronic version of a Pearl Harbor to be avoided at every reasonable cost. Let's see what I've done here. I had some words on what cyberspace combat might look like. I would put to you that anybody who wanted to write a doctoral dissertation on cyberspace warfare would probably have to do it with invisible ink after a fairly short while because of the high classification of what's been done in this arena so far. But if you just stretch your imagination a little bit, you can imagine how the face of warfare will change when this mission area becomes more developed. Just as a couple of bones to chew on, in the early aftermath of Operation Allied Force, General John Jumper, when he was still the commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe, made the interesting comment about some of the really very taxing difficulties we faced in the defense suppression arena against Soviet-trained Serbian operators. He said, wouldn't it be nice someday if instead of going into a highly defended target area and trying to bash surface-to-air missile systems with electrons and kinetic munitions, we could just somehow maliciously insert a code into its acquisition and tracking radars to convince that system that it was a refrigerator rather than a weapon. Looking at tomorrow, who knows? I mean, my own personal fanciful cyberspace weapon in air-to-air, and for those of you with wings who've flown the airplane, you can relate to this. Instead of firing a beyond visual range missile in a head-on engagement to force a desired reaction, wouldn't it be interesting if, as you were approaching the merge, you could push a button in your cockpit and it would illuminate the fire warning light in the cockpit of every enemy aircraft? I mean, it would certainly get those pilots' attention. Or shut down their digital fuel controls, or even fire their ejection seats for that matter. And I'm thinking purely off the top of my head. But, I mean, this is just scratching the surface of where I think the leading air forces in the world are going to be. Let me come to my last chart here and just say that if I could leave you with one bottom line thought about how to understand evolved American air power, it would be that while it cannot, and should never be thought of as an all-purpose substitute for a mixed and balanced force. What it has done, I mean, mature air power has evolved to a point which, again, if used wisely and properly, has the potential to make the employment of all other force elements much easier than it was before. It has allowed commanders, again, in the right enabling circumstances, to rely more and more on air and space assets to do the heavy lifting early on, so that ground forces can become increasingly freed of the need, again, to engage head-to-head in close maneuver ground combat at a risk of high casualties early on. Counterinsurgency, once again, as I mentioned earlier, poses a different set of problems, and that's where we have to say, not so fast, comrades. What worked in Desert Storm and what worked in some of the other high-end engagements we've had until recently have brought us really up to a blank sheet of paper in the new post-major combat situations we found in Iraq and Afghanistan. Counterinsurgency warfare, unlike the kinds of higher-end types I spoke about before, it's really by definition ground-centric. But even in that changed setting, air power, I'm writing a RAND study on the subject now, and I've called it the unseen war, the role of air in counterinsurgency operations. It is a player even if it doesn't dominate the headlines. Just to leave you with one example, I mentioned this, Air Marshal Patney the other day during the lunch. Just to take the case of post-surge operations in Iraq since 2007, United States forces saw an increase of about 20% in the number of troops on the ground. And yet what you don't see is at the same time there was a rise in about 400% in the number of scheduled and dedicated strike sorties, with an increase of about 1,000% in the number of precision munition releases that took place during that same period of time. And the reason why was because having finally seen the light, having the clue bird land and recognizing that we were really in an insurgency situation that required the kind of bona fide counterinsurgency strategy that General Petraeus created, we were now getting enabling actionable intelligence from human sources on the ground, whom Allied forces had for the first time protected and befriended and leveraged them into players in the joint and combined fight. Let me just say by way of conclusion that I think up till now, what I've described are by and large American monopolies. I mean, there's still, and this does no disservice to the very high capabilities of our allies and other cooperative air forces around the world, the Indian Air Force, the Israeli Air Force, and others included, to say that, you know, an Air Force that can operate an aircraft like the F-22 and the B-2 and can integrate the full spectrum of space and cyber capabilities that we have today is still something unique on the surface of the earth. And the challenge that we face is never to take that for granted and understand that it will take hard work to maintain it. Just in the realm of stealth alone, we now have the F-22 just having achieved initial operational capability. The F-35 is on the line, coming in the next decade. Stealth has been with us for more than 2 decades now, a full generation. The F-117 is already retired. The last 117 was delivered to the boneyard a couple months ago. And stealth countermeasures have come along. And it's going to take ever more work to stay one step ahead of that constant offense-defense dialectic as we try and maintain that one comparative advantage that we still do have in our modern low-observable aircraft. That's longer than I expected to talk. One could write a book about the subject. I will get off the podium at this point and be happy to engage any conversation you might have. Thanks very much, and again, great treat to be in India.